If you're taking on the role of being a director, you've signed up for a big task.
Making sure companies are paying for performance is the biggest challenge facing compensation committees today.
Emerging markets are going to create challenges for all global companies.
Corporate Board Member presents the Board Governance Series with series contributors PricewaterhouseCoopers, Meridian Compensation Partners, and Clifford Chance. On this edition of the Board Governance Series, Developing an Effective Long-Term Incentive Plan with Bob Romanchek, Partner and Senior Consultant, Meridian Compensation Partners.
Welcome to this edition of the Board Governance Series. I'm T.K. Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it is my pleasure to welcome Bob Romanchek, who's a Partner and Senior Consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. And we are going to be talking about a very relevant conversation about compensation and specifically developing an effective long-term incentive plan. And Bob, there is no shortage of bright light on the Compensation Committee.
Right.
So with that, my first question for you, it seems like we have a lot of perpetual change in the catalysts that are impacting the area of long-term incentives. So when you look at where we stand, where are we today?
Right. If you look back the last 7 to 10 years, every year it seems like we do have a new catalyst. Changes in accounting rules, tax rules, securities disclosure, etc. This year's no different. We just had from Proxy Advisory from ISS a new test that's been introduced. The test right now, the reason that it impacts long-term incentive is the first level of the test, which if you pass, by the way, you should generally be fine, focuses exclusively on the financial measure total shareholder return, or TSR. The test compares TSR on a 1 and a 3 year basis to CEO compensation. It's only CEO, no other executive, compared also to a peer group that they're going to establish. Another part of the test in that quantitative category looks at 5-year TSR, but exclusively relative, not relative, it's absolute to a company's TSR over those 5-year period, again, looking exclusively at CEO compensation. So without getting into the further details of that test, clearly, because TSR is the only financial measure that's being utilized in this new test, organizations are already reacting. Do we need to have a TSR plan put in place? Or if we've got a plan in place, do we need to further enhance that, put more weighting on that program? Do note, if you don't pass this part of the test, there is a secondary qualitative part where there's about 6 general categories of additional items that ISS is going to consider. Within that are some of the traditional financial measures, yet those are secondary in nature. So if you pass the first part of the test, you need not go further. If you score low, then you go to the subjective area, and the ISS is going to determine whether those additional factors mitigate or actually contribute to the pay misalignment. But bottom line is, if you want ISS support for your exec comp programs, you're really going to have to pay attention to total shareholder return, and thereby that is the catalyst for this new 2012 long-term incentive design year that's going to really drive practices.
Now, let's keep on that issue of the test. If a company doesn't score well on the test, what happens to the company? And I assume this is, when you say score well, is this both relative to the ISS test, and is it also relevant to the say on pay?
Mm-hmm. So first off, again, if you're looking at purely the financial measures, TSR, if you pass that test, the whole analysis stops and you have ISS support, generally speaking, need not go further. The subjective areas, now they apply that, and at the end of the day, they determine whether to give you support or not. If they determine then in their subjectivity at that point that you're still not scoring high enough, they will give you a no recommendation on the say on pay vote. That's really their first form of attack and what is the most likely occurrence. Secondly, then, they will go to the next step, as they explain, and actually for outside directors on the compensation committee up for re-election, they will recommend a no vote for the committee members. If the practices are egregious, they'll actually extend that further to the entire board, recommend a no vote for all board members. So that's the second category. The third category is if you're going for a new equity-based long-term incentive program or simply trying to replenish the share pool under existing plan. Both of those require shareholder approval, and so ISS can and will, based on this test, recommend a no vote for your plan also. So given all three of those categories, say on pay, outside director, renomination, and then new equity-based programs, all three of those are in their arsenal now, so we really do need to pay attention to these tests.
So last year, companies did fairly well with the say on pay as a rule. But this now is a change. This is a new test that's going to be looked at. And what effect do you think that's going to have on is it going to sort of stir things up a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the area of long-term incentive design, do know just based on stock market performance this last year, by definition, total shareholder return is down compared to the prior year. So immediately you know there's going to be less favorable results on a relative TSR basis for a number of organizations. So it's going to be something that is going to impact long-term incentive design. With that, a number of points to be made here. So first and foremost, do note that ISS as a proxy advisory firm is not the only proxy advisory firm out there. In addition, additional firms, a lot of the pension funds and even the larger mutual fund families, they still do their own backdoor analysis here. And if for the most part, none of them are focusing 100% exclusively on TSR, as ISS is now doing in the first step of their test here. So they are considering some of the historic financial measures and pay for performance. So you have more constituencies out there that you have to really cater to, not just ISS, although they seem to be getting a lot of the press with this new test. Secondly, then, if you look at the ISS analysis and their documentation, they are very clear to admit that a TSR program is not necessarily appropriate for every organization out there. They do identify that they expect organizations to continue to use the traditional financial measure type plan with growth, return, cash flow measures, and potentially relative TSR or some combination. And the argument that they make is that with those traditional plans, if you are enhancing those financial measures, secondarily, it should have a positive impact on TSR as well. So if they're saying they don't expect you to use TSR, and they're telling you that we need to do that, you won't get a no vote if you don't have a TSR plan, then why are they focusing exclusively on it? And if you take a step back and think about what they do for a living, they are advising shareholder firms. So to look at total shareholder return as a performance measure for them from their perspective makes a lot of sense. When you flip the coin over and you're looking at those of us who are doing actual long-term incentive design, trying to design an appropriate long-term incentive program, clearly there are many more financial and other measures you want to consider, not just TSR. So with that, where do you really start, or how is this going to impact long-term incentives? You really should take a major step back, chunk up, so to speak, and this hasn't changed. This test has not changed the analysis. You need to look at the company's business strategy, where they are in the business cycle, what are they really focusing on from an operations perspective and hoping to accomplish. With that business strategy, then, most organizations have translated that into a formal executive compensation pay philosophy. That pay philosophy, in many cases, formally publicly disclosed in the CD&A of the proxy statement. So with the business strategy, the exec comp philosophy, that still needs to be the blueprint for the appropriate design of a long-term incentive program. So finally, with that, I would step back, and if you had a blank sheet of paper, which although many do not, it's probably a good exercise to attempt, there's three traditional categories or buckets of long-term incentives. I would start with equal 1/3 weighting on all three of those, and they are stock appreciation only vehicles, stock options, SARs, where you're really looking to incent future stock price and growth. Secondly, pure full value equity-based incentives, restricted stock units, where it's time-based, really a traditional retention device, where there is a place for that, and we know restricted stock has become very prevalent. And then the third category are these performance programs, traditionally 3-year performance cycle, performance shares, performance units, and use, whether it's a financial measure, historic measure, or TSR, or some combination, that is still a very relevant category. Within these three, note the first two categories, ISS don't consider those to be performance-based, so that places an additional emphasis on that third category, where the relative TSR lies as well. But I would start with those three, take a step back, work backwards through the exec com philosophy, the business strategy, to determine whether you can get those three vehicles down to two, and then really look at the design parameters of those vehicles to see if you can customize it to really work to incent the strategy that you're after. So bottom line, the ISS new test, something to consider, but you really don't want that tail to wag the dog of long-term incentive design.
I know that Meridian Compensation Partners is in the process of launching a new app. And this app is a creative tool that compensation committees can use. Will that help in the long-term incentive part as well? Is that something that will help them?
Well, call me biased, but it absolutely will assist greatly. And from the perspective of the app has a lot of information. There's just about everything you can imagine within executive compensation, including the category of long-term incentive design. There'll be white papers, a description of these types of tests, plan design elements, a lot of data. So as a resource, it will help tremendously. I think laid on top of that, obviously, you're still going to need input and the discussions that go along with it, but it's got a lot of the background information that will assist with long-term incentive design and other areas of long-term incentive.
Well, apps are where the world's going, so it's good that you have that tool as well. And Bob, I want to thank you for joining us today on the Board Governance Series. And as usual, compensation is an important topic.
Thank you, T.K.
Bob Romanchek can be reached at bromanchek@meridiancp.com. The Board Governance Series is a presentation of corporate board member and NYSE Euronext Company.